1 Peter 1, beginning with verse 13. Therefore, prepare your minds for action. Be self-controlled. Set your hope fully on the grace to be given you when Jesus Christ is revealed. As obedient children, do not conform to the evil desires you had when you lived in ignorance. But just as he who called you is holy, so be holy in all you do. For it is written, be holy because I am holy. Since you call on a Father who judges each man's work impartially, live your lives as strangers here in reverent fear. We've been focusing this entire year for our congregational theme on being encouraged. Be encouragers. Be a Barnabas. And as we're picking up on this theme this morning, we want to be encouraged with this idea of holy living. And I want to start off, we've got to address this idea of holy living. When I use the idea, or just use the phrase holy living, probably already your mind is thinking, there's no way I can be a holy person. Unfortunately, so many ideas through the years have just kind of like cuckleburs stuck onto this idea of what holy living means. Doesn't mean perfection. We just need to erase that out of our minds. It doesn't mean that because I've done some miracle, somebody has nominated me as a saint to be holy over the centuries. That's not what he's talking about. The idea of holy is a very simple but profound one. At its root, it means that I have been separated aside, set aside for God's purposes. That's what holy means. Set aside for God's purposes. When I become a Christian, I'm saying a lot of things, but one that I'm starting off is I am proclaiming to everyone around me that knows me, I am setting my life aside for the purposes of God. Now, is that an easy thing? No, it's not. Because what you have to struggle with is all of your own selfishness, self-centeredness, how you've always set aside in the past your own life for yourself. And once you become a child of God, you're saying, God, help me move this direction so that my life can be set aside for your purposes. Commitment to God encourages this kind of living. And commitment is difficult. It's a hard word. We're going to look at two words today that are hard words for our culture now. One is commitment, the other is obedience. Neither one has a nice ring to it. So we're going to see, is there a way that we can talk about these that help us with this way of living a life set aside for God's purposes? Notice that our section that began reading in 1 Peter chapter 1 began with a little word called therefore. Therefore, prepare your minds for action. To live a holy life, it is based on an understanding of the richness, the depth, the wow factor of the salvation God has provided for us. Not only of what Jesus Christ did for us, but it was so amazing in its scope and in fulfilling God's plan that you may remember last week we talked about this prophetic grace. It's rooted in the very grace and mercy of God, and it was so amazing that even the prophets and the angels tried to look into it and see what it was all about. They were predicting, they were saying the words, but they didn't really understand what they were saying. You see, holy living, as Peter's already talked about this, is based on living hope. Living hope. Now, one of the things that we don't often think about is how crucial hope is for us every day that we wake up. I wake up in the morning with hope. Not just hope that I'm going to make all my appointments today, or hope that I can get where I can go without running out of gas. that we have these, I call these little hopes during the day. I'm talking about the grander hope that encompasses everything. We wake up in the morning with this hope, living hope, because we believe Jesus Christ, our Lord and Savior, was raised from the dead, and that resurrection makes all the difference in the world. I wonder, did you catch part of Stacy's prayer? We talk about being civil today. Civil living is much needed. Civil discourse is much needed. But holy living goes way beyond civil living. You see, I can be civil to you, but not be a Christian. You know, I can treat you in a civil way, but I don't have to be a Christian to do that. If my life is set aside for the purposes of God, it goes way beyond civil living. It's what I call living hope that embodies a resurrected way of thinking. That's why I love to see and to help others engage in what we call baptism. Because do you realize that as Paul pictures it in Romans 6, when we rise with Jesus Christ from the waters of baptism, we're not only reenacting his death, burial, and resurrection, but Paul's very clear about this. Not only is that happening, but we are being raised to a new way of living, a new life. And that's what this is all about, this holy living. So as we begin thinking about this, I want to share with you quickly what I think is crucial about being encouraged by this holy living. Peter's going to start off with something that's kind of fascinating to me. Holy living starts in the mind. Starts in the mind. And he uses an expression that literally says, having girded up the loins of your mind. It's an old expression from the time of Peter in that world. To gird up the loins of your mind is appropriating the metaphor of thinking about wearing a large overcoat, a large flowing coat. And as people would get ready to go do something serious or even to run, they would have to pull it all up together, tie the belt up, and so then you could get into action. Probably the best thing in our culture is if I were to take my coat off like this, think, okay, what is he up to? Well, one thing is I'm awful hot, so it's got to come off. Ever since June the 1st, I've not been cool. But the other thing I want to show you is what if I do this? If I unbutton this button on my sleeve, and you see me starting to do this. We understand that as preparation for action, don't we? We know something's about to happen. Okay? Now it may be all the way from washing dishes, which Nancy says I don't do enough of. I probably don't. But I've noticed several times when I do dive in, help out with the dishes, you roll up your sleeves. Or something, have you ever been dressed up like something goes wrong with your car? Oh man. And so you got to pop open the hood and you're dressed up. So what do? You roll up your sleeves. We all know what that means. You know what Peter is talking about here? Be prepared, roll up your sleeves, get prepared for action. Okay, let's see what he keeps on saying. This is amazing. Because alertness, a mind that is sober, he says, is one that has careful preparation about it. Now, when we end the lesson this morning, I'm going to read our passage from Peterson. I can't believe how he has nailed this passage. And it's too bad Walker's not here. Walker has really put me into loving Peterson. And I wish he were here so he could hear the reading of it. When we get through, I want to read, you got to hear how he paraphrases this. The mind. You see, the intellectual capacity that guides us. He talks about this mind. It directs our conduct. We have thought through. We're making choices. We know why we're doing what we're doing. But this idea of being sober means that I'm self-controlled and a clarity of mind that goes with it. This is why Paul can say, don't be drunk with wine, but be filled with the Spirit. You see, the mind can be less than sober in a lot of ways. As we think about how God has made our mind, there are questions like, what am I thinking about? What am I preparing for? How am I getting ready to live out my Christian life? What am I focusing my mind on? What am I thinking about you? See, a life that is set aside for holy living, for the purposes of God, one of the first things I have to have in that kind of life is a self-awareness of my thoughts. What am I thinking about you? Is that a right way to think about you? And if not, God, you got to help me. I've got wrong thoughts up here. How many ever fight wrong thoughts? Anybody here this morning fight wrong thoughts? They seem to, where did that come from? You know, where did that come from? We all fight that. Minds that are alert and sober. Listen to 2 Timothy 4 and verse 5. Remember, it's Paul writing to the young man Timothy. He said, Timothy, but you keep your head in all situations. That's the sober self-control. Endure hardship. Do the work of an evangelist. Discharge all the duties of your ministry. But notice how he focuses on the young man Timothy. Keep your head in all situations. Have you ever had that desire, but you know you're not quite there yet? You can think back quickly. There was a situation I didn't keep my head. Well, by God's Spirit, we need to be aware of that. Say, okay, if I'm going to live this set-aside life for God, I have to ask God to help me keep my head in all situations. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 6, Paul says, so then let us not be like others who are asleep, but let us be awake and sober. Do you know how many people around you every day are asleep spiritually? They're sleepwalking spiritually. Don't know where they are, don't know where God is. They do not know where their destiny is headed. They're not living a life that's sober in their thinking. They're not preparing to die. They're not. They're sleepwalking. And I'm assuming we're all here this morning because we don't want to sleepwalk spiritually. We want to remain alive with what we're thinking and how we're living. Peter talks about this hope is set on future grace. We talked last week about prophetic grace. This grace is one that we look forward to. It's amazing. Grace deals with our past. We're saved. We don't deserve to be. We receive God's great, wonderful mercy. We're also in God's grace now, in His mercy right now. But we're also looking forward to a future aspect of that mercy. Peter says it's going to be brought to you in the revelation of Jesus Christ in His coming. In 1 Peter 1 and verse 7, you may remember as we were looking at that in an earlier lesson, he says that your faith, it's tried by fire, it's proved genuine, and notice, it's going to be revealed in its fullest dimension when Jesus Christ is revealed. That's an amazing insight. So that my life and my destiny is going to be revealed in its fullest dimension when Christ is revealed. I'm not sure what that's going to be like, but I'm looking forward to it. Look at chapter 4 and verse 13. He again is going to tie this concept of the work of Christ and grace to His coming. He said, dear friends, don't be surprised at the painful trials you have to go through because you've made the commitment. But rejoice that you participate in the sufferings of Christ. And we're going to have a future lesson that talks about what all that is. So that you may be overjoyed when His glory is revealed. As Christians, we're not going to be just joyful when He returns. We're going to be overjoyed when He comes. Now, do you see yourself being overjoyed when He comes? That's our mindset. That's our hope. That's one of the reasons why we're set aside for the purposes of God. Peter then goes on to say, as obedient children. Obedience is a hard sell to all of us who are heirs of the Reformation movement. I don't know if you knew this. This is the 500th anniversary of Martin Luther this year. So there's been a lot of stuff on the internet, a lot of programs on TV. Martin Luther had some real concerns about the church of his day. And I think he was onto something when he realized you just don't obey people just because they say you have to. I understand that. I think he was onto something. But when when that's your heritage, if we're not careful, we become children of spiritual self-reliance, so that I don't need to obey anybody, and I especially don't like the idea of obeying God. I want God to bless me in what I've already decided. Obedience is a hard thing. But he said we are children of God. And this obedience means that it is because we're his children, it's a term of endearment that expresses God's deepest concern. Those of you who have been parents, who are grandparents, you know that when you pronounce a command that you want the child to obey, sometimes you don't have the time to give all the background explanation as to why they shouldn't run out in the road. You don't have time. Stop! And it may sound pretty harsh at the moment, but it is given out of a heart of care and knowing the danger that's there. So we have to understand that when God gives us a way of life to live, he's not trying to take all the fun and happiness out of life. That's not what Scripture is about. Scripture is the direction of God coming from his heart of love and care, because we are his dear children. That's who we are. Back in chapter 1, verse 2 of 1 Peter, remember, we're chosen by God. And I think this was the first time that this really sunk in. We are chosen by God to be obedient. Now, I've grown up all my life thinking about being obedient to God. I understand that. But the Christian life means we're chosen by God to be obedient. That's just who we are. In chapter 1, verse 22, we're also purified by obedience to the truth, and we understand that. But you see, God our Father cares about our obedience, which is attitudes, motives, and behaviors, all of them. And Peter says, I don't want you to think back on your former way of life, which was lived in ignorance. I don't want you to fashion yourself, to take your life and live it after a self-centered ignorance. There are a lot of ignorant people today that don't know who God is, don't know his word, don't know anything about kingdom living, don't know anything about right living. But Peter says, because of the gospel, Christ has come to enlighten people. Be holy in all you do. This is a quote from Leviticus chapter 44 or chapter 11, verses 44 and 45, and Leviticus 19, verse 2. This stands written. It's neat how he says that. It is written, it stands written. It is the word of God revealed. It stands written, which means it's just as powerful now, Peter says, as when I'm quoting it, as when it was first written. It stands written because God is holy. This is one of the neat traits of God. If you were to sit down and have a discussion with someone, and you were to share with them who is God, what would you say? Where would you start? Who is God? People have all kinds of ideas about who God is. Who is God? He is holy. He's wholly other. He's separate from his creation. And just as God is separate from his creation, he's going to capitalize off of that dynamic idea and say that we as Christians then are separated out of the world that he created to be his people ready to live for him. We are to be separate and set apart as other for God's use. And in all of this that we do, there was a French writer a few years ago. His name was Jean-Pierre Dussault. And he coined this phrase, the sacrament of the present moment, which is the idea that in every given moment I live, I don't care if I'm at work, if I'm at home or in my car, every present moment, I need to recognize that moment I am living a separated life for God. So there's no such thing as a holy part of my life and an unholy part of my life. When I was younger, I picked up a little brochure that gave me the wrong idea. You know, don't believe everything you read. This brochure said, okay, we got 7 days of the week. And the author who wrote this little brochure used 7 apples in the picture. And he said, you've got 6 apples the rest of the week to take bites out of. That's your week. But Sunday is God's day. And I grew up with that idea. Sunday's God's day. Can't mow the lawn on Sunday. That's God's day. Don't you dare. That's work. You know, all of us have had to struggle through some of that. But the idea that there's only one day for God and the other 6 are mine, I'm here to tell you a lot of people think that way. Now, I know none of us here do, so I'm not worried about you. There are a lot of other people that do. Sunday is God's day, rest of the week's mine. But I don't know where you find that in the Bible. Be all that you are, every moment, every day, to the glory of God. And then to live in reverent fear. We call on God. We use prayer in times of trouble. We should, but that's not the only time. This God is described as impartially judging. And again, that is so separate and that is apart from what we do. Do you know it's so easy to judge someone with a partial judgment? And I almost like to look at it this way. How many of us have been guilty of making judgments on people because all that we see at that moment about them is we're peeking through a little knothole, and that's all we see of them. But what we see in that little knothole, that's the conclusion we draw about them. You talk about partial judgment, that's the worst thing in the world. Kind of like the little illustration of the child looking through the knothole in the fence, and he sees the clown and he sees the elephant in the circus going by, but he thinks that's all there is. That's all he can see. God's impartial. And Peter says, I want you to conduct yourselves in reverent fear during the time of your stay here. Perhaps we need to have a call back to a reverent fear of God. Who is this God? What makes God happy? What makes God angry? What delights God's heart? How much holy other is He than myself? What can God do that brings me to a point of awesome response, of the wow factor? It didn't take long to think about that one. Conduct yourselves during the time of your stay here in reverent fear. I can remember growing up, my parents would instill into us a little bit of fear. Now, so-and-so's coming today, so you better behave. We were put on our best behavior. So-and-so's coming, you better behave. Well, what does it mean to live in reverent fear every day for who God is? This awesome reverential fear. It's a motivation for our conduct. Now, I know that years ago we used to sing a wonderful song, and I kind of took it the wrong way. Again, I was younger. How many of you remember singing the song, There's an All-Seeing Eye Watching You? Any of you remember that old song? There's an all-seeing eye watching you. In my naivete as a young person, guess what I thought? There was a great big old eyeball up in the sky watching me. Well, you know what? Let's back up a moment. That may not be too bad. God does watch us. God watches every move that we make because we're His dear children. And if we have a life of holy living set aside for His purposes, why wouldn't we want Him? Why wouldn't we want to think about His seeing every move that we make? So we're encouraged by holy living, this life set apart for the purpose of God. It means our minds are alert and sober. It means our hope is set on future grace. It means as obedient children we come to Him because He knows who we are and He cares for us, that we're holy in all of our life. Every aspect of our life is covered by God's presence and awareness, and we live in that reverent fear. I want to close with Peterson's paraphrase of this passage. So roll up your sleeves. Well, we did. Put your mind in gear. Be totally ready to receive the gift that's coming when Jesus arrives. Are you totally ready? Don't lazily slip back into those old grooves of evil, doing just what you feel like doing. You didn't know any better then, but you do now. Oh boy, you talk about that. That really hits home, doesn't it? There was a time we didn't know any better. You do now. As obedient children, let yourselves be pulled into a way of life shaped by God's life. A life energetic and blazing with holiness. God said, I'm holy, you be holy. You call out to God for help, and He helps. He's a good Father who's impartial that way. But don't forget, He also is a responsible Father. And I want you to hear this last phrase. He won't let you get by with sloppy living. He won't let you get by with sloppy living. This morning, are you involved in sloppy living? Do you need to come back to God who will help you to set aside your life for Him? That living hope that's the foundation for this kind of separate, holy living. If you need to become a Christian, give your heart to God. If you wish to be baptized, we can assist you with that. Maybe you need to come forward with prayer. We can assist you in any way. Maybe you've been involved in sloppy living. And you don't have to come down to the front. We've got people to be in the back, all around. In any way, if we can, help you spiritually with your life to live a holy life, separate and set aside for God's purposes. Would you come when we stand and sing?